Before we start, tell me where you are listening from in the comments. Maybe you are someone who thinks successful people live charmed lives, protected from real danger. Maybe you assume that having wealth and private jets eliminates the risks that ordinary people face. Maybe you have never experienced a moment when you were supposed to die but somehow survived, and how that changes everything about how you understand purpose, time, and what you are meant to contribute to the world. This conversation is for you. I want to tell you about the day I should have died. The day when mechanical failure, human error, and pure chance combined in ways that should have killed everyone on board a small aircraft flying over the Mojave Desert. A day that changed my understanding of mortality, destiny, and the possibility that some lives are protected for reasons that extend beyond luck or coincidence. This was not about business risks, or financial losses, or any of the calculated dangers that come with building companies and pursuing ambitious projects. This was about facing actual death, accepting that I was going to die, and then somehow surviving an experience that should have been impossible to survive. Today, I want to share the story because I believe many people take their continued existence for granted, never fully grasping how fragile life is or how quickly everything can change. But I also want to share what happened after I survived, because sometimes near-death experiences provide clarity about purpose and priorities that cannot be gained any other way. This experience forced me to confront questions about why I am still alive, what I am supposed to accomplish with the time I have been given, and whether survival creates obligations that extend beyond personal success and happiness. The crash changed my relationship with risk, with time, with fear, and with the possibility that consciousness and purpose operate according to principles that exceed rational understanding. It taught me that some experiences cannot be explained, but can nevertheless transform how you see your life and your responsibilities to the world. It was February 14th, 2008, and I was flying from Los Angeles to Las Vegas in a small Cessna Citation with 3 other passengers, 2 SpaceX engineers, and a potential investor who was considering a significant contribution to our funding round. We had been working 18-hour days trying to prove that a private company could successfully develop rockets, and this trip was supposed to be a brief break from the intense pressure we were under. The flight should have taken less than an hour. The weather was clear, the aircraft had been recently serviced, and our pilot was experienced with thousands of hours flying similar routes. Everything seemed routine as we took off from Van Nuys Airport and climbed toward our cruising altitude. But 20 minutes into the flight, while we were crossing the Mojave Desert at 8,000 feet, something went catastrophically wrong with our aircraft's electrical system. The first indication of trouble was when all the instrument lights on the control panel began flickering erratically, followed by complete failure of the navigation and communication systems. Our pilot, Captain Rodriguez, immediately began troubleshooting procedures while trying to maintain control of the aircraft. But within minutes, it became clear that we were facing multiple system failures that were cascading in ways that made normal flight operations impossible. The engine began losing power intermittently, causing the aircraft to shudder and lose altitude unpredictably. The flight controls became increasingly unresponsive, requiring enormous physical effort just to keep the plane level. Most terrifyingly, we had lost all radio contact with air traffic control and had no way to navigate or call for help. Captain Rodriguez announced that we needed to find a place to land immediately, but looking out the windows, all we could see was empty desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. No airports, no roads, no flat areas large enough for an aircraft to land safely. As we continued losing altitude and engine power, the reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. We were going to crash in the middle of nowhere, with no way to communicate our location to potential rescuers, and virtually no chance that anyone would survive the impact. I had faced business failures, public criticism, and financial crises that had seemed devastating at the time, but nothing had prepared me for the experience of accepting that I was going to die within the next few minutes, that my children would grow up without their father, that the companies I had built would continue without me, that all my plans and projects and dreams would end abruptly in the Mojave Desert. What surprised me most was how calm I became once I accepted the inevitability of our crash. Instead of panic or rage or desperate attempts to change our circumstances, I felt a strange peace that came from releasing my attachment to outcomes that were completely beyond my control. I found myself thinking about my children and whether I had been a good enough father to them during the time we had together. I thought about the employees at Tesla and SpaceX who were depending on the companies I had started to provide them with meaningful work and financial security. I thought about the technologies we were developing and whether someone else would continue that work if I was not there to drive it forward. But I also experienced something that I can only describe as a download of understanding about my life, my purpose, and the work I was meant to accomplish. As our aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent toward the desert floor, I had a sudden clarity about the projects I should be prioritizing, the problems that most needed my attention, and the contributions I was meant to make if I somehow survived this experience. I understood that my survival would not be about luck or coincidence, but about responsibility. That being given additional time would create obligations to use that time in ways that served purposes larger than my own interests and ambitions. With less than 2 minutes before impact, Captain Rodriguez spotted what appeared to be a dry lake bed about 3 miles ahead of us. It was not an ideal landing site, but it was flat and long enough that we might be able to survive a crash landing if he could maintain enough control to reach it. Using every bit of his skill and experience, Captain Rodriguez managed to guide our failing aircraft toward the lake bed while our engine continued to sputter and lose power. The flight controls were so unresponsive that it took both his hands and feet working together just to make small adjustments to our trajectory. We approached the lake bed at a steep angle and much higher speed than would be safe for a normal landing. Captain Rodriguez warned us to brace for impact and prepare for the aircraft to break apart when we hit the ground. The crash itself was violent and terrifying. We struck the hard-packed earth at over 100 miles per hour, bounced twice, and skidded for several hundred yards before the aircraft finally came to rest. The impact was so severe that I was sure we were all dead, even though I was still conscious and could hear the sounds of twisted metal settling around us. But somehow, impossibly, we were all alive, injured, shaken, and trapped in a damaged aircraft in the middle of the desert, but alive when we should have been dead. The aircraft's fuselage had cracked, but had not broken apart completely. The landing gear had collapsed, the wings were severely damaged, and every window was shattered, but the passenger compartment had remained intact enough to protect us from fatal injuries. Captain Rodriguez had suffered a broken arm and possible internal injuries. One of the SpaceX engineers had a concussion and several broken ribs. The potential investor had a dislocated shoulder and cuts from flying glass. I had a separated shoulder and various bruises, but was otherwise uninjured. We were stranded in the middle of the Mojave Desert with no working radio, no way to signal for help, and injuries that required medical attention. But we were alive when every rational calculation suggested we should have been dead. We spent the next 6 hours waiting in the wreckage, while our families and colleagues realized we were missing and organized search efforts. The temperature in the desert was over 100 degrees, we had limited water, and some of our injuries were becoming more serious as time passed. But during those hours of waiting, I experienced a profound sense of gratitude and purpose that I had never felt before. I was grateful not just for surviving, but for being given additional time to complete work that suddenly felt more important and urgent than it had before the crash. I spent those hours thinking about the projects at Tesla and SpaceX that had seemed challenging but not critical, and recognizing that they were actually essential pieces of larger purposes that I had not fully understood before facing death. I realized that sustainable transportation and multiplanetary life were not just interesting business opportunities, but technologies that could determine whether human civilization survived the challenges it would face in the coming decades. I understood that the urgency I had felt about these projects was not just entrepreneurial ambition, but intuition about their importance to humanity's future that had been confirmed by my near-death experience. When we were finally rescued by a search helicopter that had been dispatched from Edwards Air Force Base, I felt like I was being given a second life rather than just continuing the life I had before. That my survival created obligations to use my remaining time more purposefully and effectively than I had been using it. The physical recovery from the crash took several months. My separated shoulder required surgery, and I had to rebuild strength and mobility that had been lost during the healing process. But the psychological and spiritual impact of the experience was immediate and permanent. I became much more conscious of how I was spending my time, and whether my daily activities were aligned with the larger purposes I had understood during those moments when I thought I was going to die. I started making decisions based on long-term significance rather than short-term profitability or convenience. I began prioritizing projects that could have meaningful impact on important problems, even when those projects seemed risky or difficult. Most importantly, I developed a different relationship with failure and setbacks. Having faced actual death and survived, business challenges and public criticism seemed much less threatening. I became more willing to take risks and pursue ambitious goals because I had learned that the worst possible outcome, death, was something I could face with peace and acceptance. The crash also changed my understanding of time and urgency. Before the accident, I had operated with the assumption that I would have decades to accomplish my goals and that there was always time to delay difficult decisions or postpone important projects. After the crash, I became acutely aware that time is limited and unpredictable, that opportunities can disappear without warning, and that delaying important work because it seems challenging or risky is actually the greatest risk of all. I started working with increased intensity and focus, not because I was anxious about death, but because I was grateful for the time I had been given and wanted to use it as effectively as possible. The experience also gave me a different perspective on legacy and what it means to leave something meaningful behind. Before the crash, I had thought about success primarily in terms of personal achievement and financial outcomes. After the crash, I began thinking about success in terms of contribution to problems that would still matter long after I was gone. Technologies that could help humanity become a multiplanetary species, transportation systems that could reduce environmental damage, innovations that could improve life for people I would never meet. This shift in perspective made work more meaningful and satisfying, but it also created pressure to accomplish more in less time. I became impatient with activities that did not serve larger purposes and more demanding of myself and others when it came to execution and results. The crash had one more unexpected consequence. It made me more open to the possibility that consciousness and purpose operate according to principles that exceed rational understanding. The fact that we survived an accident that should have killed us, that Captain Rodriguez was able to maintain enough control to reach the lakebed despite multiple system failures, that the aircraft held together just enough to protect us during impact, seemed like more than coincidence. I began to consider the possibility that some lives are protected because they have work to complete, that survival sometimes creates obligations rather than just providing relief, and that near-death experiences can provide guidance about purpose that is not available through ordinary consciousness. This does not mean I believe in supernatural intervention or predetermined destiny, but it does mean I am more open to the possibility that reality includes dimensions of meaning and purpose that exceed what materialist science currently acknowledges. The crash taught me that survival is not guaranteed, that life can end without warning, and that the time we have is both precious and uncertain. But it also taught me that facing death can provide clarity about life, that accepting mortality can reduce fear about failure, and that understanding how quickly everything can change can motivate you to use your time more purposefully. 17 years after the crash, I still think about that day regularly, not because I am traumatized by the experience, but because it provides perspective on current challenges and guidance about priorities. When I am struggling with difficult decisions or feeling overwhelmed by the scope of problems I am trying to solve, I remember the clarity I felt during those moments when I thought I was going to die. I remember the understanding I had about which projects really mattered and why urgent action was necessary. When I am facing criticism or setbacks that feel discouraging, I remember that I have already faced the worst possible outcome and discovered that it was something I could accept with peace. That knowledge makes other challenges feel manageable by comparison. When I am tempted to delay important work because it seems too difficult or risky, I remember that time is limited and unpredictable, and that the greatest risk is not taking action when action is needed. The crash changed everything about how I understand my relationship with time, risk, and purpose. It taught me that survival can be a form of responsibility, that additional time should be used thoughtfully, and that facing mortality can reduce fear about everything else. I was supposed to die in that plane crash in the Mojave Desert in February 2008. The fact that I did not die that all four of us survived an accident that should have been fatal feels like more than luck or coincidence. It feels like being given additional time to complete work that matters, to contribute to solutions for problems that could affect humanity's future, and to use whatever capabilities I have been given in ways that justify the survival I should not have experienced. That sense of borrowed time has made every day since the crash feel more urgent and more precious. It has motivated me to work harder, take bigger risks, and pursue goals that seemed impossible before I learned that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. The worst thing that can happen is wasting the time you have been given, failing to contribute to important work when you have the capability to help, and reaching the end of your life knowing that you could have done more with the opportunities you were provided. If you are someone who takes your continued existence for granted, who postpones important work because it seems challenging or risky, who lives as if you have unlimited time to accomplish your goals, I want you to know that life is more fragile and unpredictable than most people realize. But I also want you to know that understanding mortality can be liberating rather than frightening, that accepting the uncertainty of life can motivate you to use your time more purposefully, that facing your own death, whether literally or imaginatively, can provide clarity about what really matters and what work deserves your attention. Sometimes the most important insights come not from success or achievement, but from moments when everything you think you control is suddenly taken away from you. Sometimes survival teaches you more about life than comfort ever could. Sometimes being given additional time feels like being given additional responsibility, not just to enjoy your life, but to contribute something meaningful to the world while you have the opportunity to do so. Share this with someone who might need to be reminded that time is limited and precious, that survival can create responsibilities as well as relief, and that facing mortality can provide clarity about purpose. Subscribe if these conversations help you think about how to use your time more intentionally. And remember, none of us know how much time we have or when our opportunities to contribute might end. The question is not whether you will face mortality, but whether you will use the time you have been given in ways that justify the gift of your continued existence.